Thank you, Claudia. So good afternoon, everyone. It's really my pleasure to be here with you today and to share more about the research Jacob and I have led on driver strategies and about drugs trafficking in the port of Rotterdam. We focused on cocaine and also on the side of public officials. So first, to give the background, we really try to emphasize, on the one hand, the facilitators of drug trafficking. So I've included an image of the port and the port's development in the Rotterdam, which is in the southwest of the Netherlands. And it's the largest port of Europe, and this is really a key point because the illicit trade is latching on the back of formal trade routes. So this has become the formal routes become also the path of informal trafficking of cocaine. And on the other hand, also the visual gives an idea of that on the one hand, the port is really, really big, but it's also a very complex space. We can imagine there are many public sector actors, many private sector actors. The port should be efficient. On the other hand, we should also be secure. So this makes it a very complicated arena to really securitize and make the port. So in the next slide, Claudia, we dig deeper into the drivers of border corruption. On the one hand, this is about a lot more stronger political prioritization of fighting drugs trafficking. So although fighting drugs trafficking has always been an important topic for the government over the last few decades, the last few years, starting at 2020, last respective governments, they've poured a lot of more money in fighting this type of crime. So in the amounts of hundreds and hundreds of millions of euros to fight this crime. And this relates to the point that Jacoba made about the secondary cost of crime. So in the Netherlands, there's always been this thing about the underworld and the upper world, and the two normally don't clash. And this is no longer the case because we have rising insecurity associated with the drugs trafficking. The latest or the biggest mega trial around a corruption case involving drugs trafficking saw a journalist being shot in the streets, lawyers being killed. So there is a lot more violence associated with the crime, and that is impacting also the way in which the state is functioning. And this is a very big concern in the Netherlands because they're seeing that the problem is not just corruption, it's also the undermining the democratic state, which is considered a very big consequence of drugs trafficking. On the side of the port as well, there have been lots more stronger efforts also to being able to detect drugs trafficking. So we have automatization, we have digitization, lots of improvement and strengthening of systems and control, being able to catch that illicit drugs are in containers. So this combined effort, on the one hand, of the port being, the biggest port that trade will come always through the port and illicit trade will latches onto it. But on the other side, that the obstacles have been raised to be able to do so makes it that inside help is more needed now to be able to do this successfully. And this is also where corruption has now reared its head more. So in the next slide, Claudia, we dig a little bit deeper also to specify what we're talking about. So in the framework Jacobo introduced, he introduced that we have the side on the private actors. So we're really discussing about organized crime, which might be an image that is not necessarily known outside of the Netherlands, but we're talking about big crime groups that are involved in this trade. Normally, this involves drugs that is coming from Latin America and comes through the port of Rotterdam and then goes onwards to other countries. So the Netherlands becomes a transit country. They are often latched onto fruit transports, which would follow the logical route of the fruit transport, but also has the convenience that they should be processed quite quickly. And they are operating as kind of logistical companies that have specializations that can engage other people for specific skills. But also, we're not talking about a mafia that is like a big hierarchical organization, but multiple crime groups having multiple lines moving the drugs through the port where they might cooperate with each other. So This is a really important point. We're not talking about small individual people that are involved, but big crime organizations. So in the next slide, Claudia, we really make the point that because of the fact that these obstacles have been increased, these corruption risks are going up, and it's really corruption becomes in this sense functional and it's strategic to be able to overcome these hurdles. And in our research, we focused on which is the other side of the framework that Jacobo introduced on the public official side. We focused on the role of customs because they have a very important role in being able to detect illicit cargo on containers, but also by virtue of their position, by the knowledge they have, the role they have, they become also people that are vulnerable now for being engaged or being engaged for corruption or as part of needing this kind of insider help to be able to get it done. So in the next slide, Claudia, we give a typology of what this now really means. So we looked at the desk research, but we also dug through cases more recently of drug-related corruption cases and what now the aim was of this corruption. So on the one hand, there's two big hurdles or obstacles to get the drugs in and passing the point where there would be a screening, but also out of the port again. And here, information and assistance is really critical. So on the one hand, for instance, on the information side would be what are the criteria used by customs to be able to decide which container gets opened, which not. Or assistance would be when a cargo has been flagged for further inspection, being able to remove the drugs beforehand already, or giving access to part of the ports where people are not supposed to be able to get the drugs out. So it's about information and assistance that gives this kind of different ways to avoid basically this detection. So in the next slide, Claudia, we also dig deeper into what this corruption looks like, because it's of course we're speaking about a form of bribery, but still, how can we characterize this? And we find both what Jacobo has introduced about collusion and coercion there. So the collusion on the one hand is opportunistic and targeted. So it works both ways. On the one hand, let's say from the perspective of the customs officials, they are now more at risk of being co-opted, but at the same time, their position offers also this opportunity now to also explore this. So they're being co-opted to support by providing assistance or information. They can be targeted, for instance, by looking at which officials on social media, if they post something, they could be targeted, or it could be through family and friends being able to build a network with these people. So we're talking here about collusion because there will be an exchange. So the officials being asked to do something or to not do something, and a financial gain is being made here. But there is also a coercive element, because it's really important. This is why we emphasize we're dealing with organized crime. So one of the cases of a corruption involving customs officials is one that's named the Gerrit G. And this person received millions to be able to allow organized crime groups to avoid being detected and getting the drugs through the port. At the same time, he was saying, I was being put under pressure. I could not refuse, and all of this. So you can imagine both are true at the same time. Because we are dealing with the element of violence. Because when you say no, what would be the next step now? That the crime group could be able to put pressure. And another element which we complemented the framework that was presented earlier is around infiltration, which is the one that I think understand the least, but I think it's very relevant. So part of our research, we also looked at court cases, which included, for instance, telephone tappings that they had done, and one involved one between a member of a crime group and someone that had previously worked at the customs department. And this person was asked, well, find a way to work now in this specific department, or find a friend that can work there, find a way in, and you would have lots of, gold in your hand, this person was saying. So if we think about this, this is much more than, it's not necessarily coercion. Maybe there's an element of fear there to be able to comply, but it's much more than collusion, because we're talking about members of the crime group becoming embedded within offices. So this is something that is very a different form of corruption that's even more, I think, has even more of a negative impact. And really what we see is that there are very much blurred lines. We're talking about there will always be a financial gain, but there is an element of threat always also in these dynamics. So it makes it, and at the same time, what we learned, this is kind of a long-lasting cooperation, because once you're in, it's very difficult to get out. So in the next slide, Claudia. We also dug deeper into the way these bribery and money laundering strategies work, because it's one thing to say, well, someone is being bribed, but where does this money now go? Because we're living in a country where every account is scrutinized for, and where you deposit a small amount of money, this will already raise a red flag by the banks. So on the one hand, it's really important to say, when we're looking at these court cases, that the amount that are involved are huge. They are in the millions. So this is really an important thing we wanted to emphasize, because most of the literature always around why would a public official engage in corruption? Well, it would be, well, the salaries are low, but this is not the case in the Netherlands. And at the same time, the lure of millions, of course, can give this same driver of being able to engaging in collusion. So we're talking about receiving a bribe and then either not doing something or failing to act or providing information, and this money is paid in cash or in assets and drugs. And we also wanted to understand better, now, how do we now launder the proceeds of this money? Now, where does this now suddenly go to be able to have a gain from it? Because without being able to use it, what's the point? So a really important strategy was, of course, to make sure that to hide or to somehow make it seem that the money has a legal origin. It was given by someone else, or it's come from an informal business, or we've won it in a lottery or a casino. But also very interesting, where this kind of a network corruption comes back in, that would be the helping hide the bribe money with people that are part of the network or professional specialists, but also using professional specialists to move money out of the Netherlands using various strategies. So the cash could also be hidden in the house. So many cases, the money was found in the house, hidden somewhere in safes, or exchanged for other currency, or invested in assets and business. And this is interesting because as part of the cases, oftentimes there are luxury products that are found, assets, so for instance, houses, cars, boats that are in the Netherlands or abroad, or involving in business that have this more complex financial structures. And a very interesting dynamic, for instance, also how the way in which these strategies evolve to cope with, for instance, strict money laundering, anti-money laundering rules that are present in the Netherlands. The facilitation, for instance, of buying assets, which normally are not allowed to be done in cash in the Netherlands, let's say big properties, but being able to pay more to be able to do so, to find this, and which still would allow you to buy these assets. So lots of different quite sophisticated strategies to being able to circumvent, which are very strong anti-money laundering rules in the Netherlands that are present. So in the next slide, Claudia, we really want to make the big point that we make in our research, which is that what we see, these different strategies, they're following the path of least resistance. So it doesn't mean that these counter strategies that are being developed are somehow easy. It means that when there's an obstacle, there's a counter strategy being developed in this regard. And the underlying driver for all of this is the demand, the high profits to be made, which is forcing this counter strategy to be able to circumvent what is there. So on the next slide, Claudia, we lay that out for the corruption strategies. So on the one hand, in our research, we highlight that the corruption risks increase as a direct result of enforcement efforts being stronger. So now we have more money pouring into fighting organized crime, lots of strengthened systems in the port that gives rise to corruption risk. So perhaps previously it was not necessary. the drugs could move through. But now this inside help is needed, which gives rise to risks. At the same time, it also shifts. For instance, new systems and processes, like we see in the port, also shift and adapt the nature of corruption. So if we think of border corruption, maybe our first idea comes to a checkpoint and this person sitting there receiving a bribe to open this checkpoint. But if we have a port where everything is automated, digitized, this doesn't exist. So how does the corruption now transform as a result of different processes and structures that are put in place? At the same time, we're not talking about strategy and counter strategy, but a constant evolution of these strategies. For instance, on the side of customs, they also realized, well, hey, our staff are at risk because they are now they are having this discretionary power, and that is being exploited because they are now being targeted by crime groups. So they also tightened the systems there, reducing discretionary power, making the loopholes they discovered that allowed these customs officials to be co-opted and to be able to circumvent the systems that were in place were closed, which also means at the same time they are now less attractive for the crime networks to be co-opted. But then the question comes, who is next? So on the one hand, the corruption risk can increase, they can shift, they can adapt. And the same also comes to collusion and coercion, because we can say they are different things, but if we see them on a line, they are definitely going from less problematic to increasingly more problematic. So once someone is not cooperating and you really need this person to cooperate, this is where the threat of violence kicks in. And if you need a structural solution to solving your insider problem, infiltration becomes the strategy. So we see here that these corruption strategies are very much adaptive. So in the next slide, Claudia, we also lay this out for the trafficking strategies. So what we see in the port of Rotterdam, we've seen that as a result of all of these measures that we're taking, the seizures went up in 2023, but then afterwards they also dropped. And this is being associated with being able to detect better that the drugs are there, and also this deterrence effect. But at the same time, we also have a risk. We also have a risk that what could also be at play, or what could also explain that we have if we consider the image of the path of least resistance, what is now the counter strategy? What are now the ways in which we can circumvent these rules? For instance, I mentioned that fruit transport were often used as the way to put the illicit drugs onto the cargo of fruit. It's the lateral route of these containers, and they need to be processed swiftly. Now fruit cargo is all of them will be checked in the port of Rotterdam. Now, what are now another strategy? What other ways could you now use as a concealment method? So this is now also coming up. So using different other types of containers, cocaine being washed in with other produce. And another strategy would be shrinking. So before we had lots of drugs coming in one cargo, and now spreading the risks almost like a business decision. So we have more detection, but fewer drugs being caught at the same time. So different changing concealment strategy. And another big one is that what seems to be emerging, not only in the port of Rotterdam, but other ports in the northern of Europe, is too that there is less, that the port itself is being avoided, and it's going to other ports in Europe, so the southern ports more. So here we see not only that the concealment strategies can potentially change, but also the trafficking routes. So here, I included that the statement from one of the interviewees that the criminals always find the weakest spot. So this is really an important way to think about, what are now these counter strategies that are being developed. So on the next slide, Claudia. We highlight really the big point in our research, which is that it's really incredibly hard to really understand what is happening. So seizures being up or down is not necessarily an indicator of the amount of drugs that are being trafficked through the port. Same with corruption. We only see the thing that is being caught, detected. So we're dealing with a dark number. So what is really happening? We need very good indicators of being able to capture that. And the other big point is the unintended consequences, because most of the time this kind of strategy, counter strategy, is like a game of chess. I make a move with my king and someone else makes a move with something else. If we think about this kind of contrast between what the crime strategies are and what the counter strategies are from the side of preventing drugs coming in and through the ports. But what we see in the Netherlands is not just strategy, counter strategy, but an ever increasing negative impact on society because of the strategies that are being developed. So increasing in violence, or this push from coercion to infiltration, those are strategies. They are not the same as before. So we can see adaptation of crime strategies, but what happens with that is that the impact it has on society becomes even greater, because what they need to do now to circumvent this rule is not equal to before. They will need to do even worse strategies. So this is really an important point. So on the last slide, Claudia, this is why we focused our recommendations. On the one hand, that we be able to understand these red flags. So I hope I've given, also more ideas around this. We need to understand really what is now the red flag of, is our measures really strengthening deterrence, or have we seen a push now to different concealment strategies, or is drugs really moving through different ports? So we need to have the good indicator to be able to capture really what is happening, not the thing we can only see, which is seizures. And at the same time, we need to think ahead. So not just how does this measure now solve the problem we see in the port, but rather think also ahead. How does this new measure now incentivize the development of new strategies? Now, thinking from the perspective of those that want to do these things, how would they now move? How would they now strategy? And again, thinking about that. So we need foresight for that. So thank you.